Still some people coming in, but we might get started. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your busy schedules, and I think for a lot of you, probably delegating bedtimes and whatnot for to join us this evening. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Sam, and I'll be your host for this evening. Um, this is the first of this type of webinar that we've done for quite some time, but it's something that we want to try and make a semi-regular thing. We've got quite a diverse and quite deep range of knowledge base and skill sets amongst our practitioners at Club 360, and we want to try and bring as much relevant health information to the Tokyo community as possible. Just a few quick housekeeping things. I will get everyone to keep their microphones on mute throughout the session, and I think everyone's have got their cameras turned off, but as you heard, the session is being recorded, so if you want to turn your camera on, that's fine, but just keep that in mind. Feel free to write questions in the chat box. I will keep an eye on this, and if I feel like the questions sort of fit in with the flow of Rebecca's presentation, then I might bring them up at the time. Otherwise, we'll have some time for questions afterwards. And if you're happy to ask the question yourself, then just put that down in the chat as well. And when we get to it, I will ask you to unmute and ask your question. So with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Rebecca McCarroll is a registered dietitian from New Zealand with almost 15 years experience in the field, including nutrition research, public health, as well as private practice dietetics. Amongst her several areas of special clinical interest is childhood nutrition, and she is also a mother of two. So without any further ado, so I'll hand it over to Rebecca, and I hope you enjoy the session.
Great. Thanks, Sam, and hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time tonight to come and listen to this. I'm sure, well, maybe this is a positive. You probably, as Sam said, delegated bedtime, so hopefully you don't have a child on your lap right now. As Sam said, I've got two children. They are 3 and 4.5. And a little bit about myself, you can probably skip over this pretty quickly, but I come here from the University of Auckland, where I've been for the last 10 years. And yeah, nothing more really to be said other than I'm a dietitian and clinical nutritionist. So I'm going to get going. I just want to talk to you briefly about what we're going to discuss tonight. I'm going to try cover a wide range of ages here, both right from infancy through to 7, 8, 9, that kind of age, and older as well. I mean, lots of the concepts work for all ages of child, but there are some very specific infant ones too, just so you know. Okay, so I'm going to talk about key nutrients your child needs, how to make a balanced meal, tips for feeding baby for the first time, the development of taste, selective eating, the microbiome, and food allergies and intolerances. All right. So the first, just like as a brief, the first 1,000 days from the time of conception to 2 years of age is the most dramatic period of growth and development in a child's life. And that during this time, the foundations of lifelong health can be built, and also behaviors as well. So that's the first couple of years. So the time from pregnancy through to the child's second birthday is pretty critical for optimal growth, nutrition, and dietary patterns. That being said, we can always change, and it's like behavior as well with our children. We're learning to be parents, and there are always things that we can learn and change that will benefit our children. So what are the key nutrients we need to think about here? So the key nutrients that I'll talk about tonight are calcium, vitamin D, iron, healthy fats, and vitamin B12. I'll just touch on very briefly if a child is vegan. So calcium to start with. So it's the most abundant mineral in the body. It's 99% of it is contained in the bones and teeth. So adequate calcium intake in life is important for a growing healthy skeleton, and also for minimizing bone loss later in age, so in older age. So when I think about giving my children calcium now, I'm preparing their bones for now, but actually I'm thinking a lot more into the future. In my practice, I see people of all ages, and with the older people, I've seen quite a few people with osteoporosis who didn't have enough calcium early in life. So where do we find calcium? We find it in cow's milk and milk products such as yogurt and cheese. So these are really readily available sources of calcium. But we also find it in fortified soy milk. And I know there are soy milks in Japan that are fortified with calcium. What that means is that the calcium's been added into the soy milk. And it's also found in sardines, tofu, bok choy, spinach, almonds, walnuts, and dried figs. And calcium works with vitamin D to basically help with the development of strong bones. And as I mentioned, I'll talk about vitamin D soon. So breast milk and infant formula are good sources of calcium. However, over time, if you're breastfeeding your child, the calcium in the breast milk actually declines with time. So around the time of 4 to 6 months of age, when the child is getting ready to eat solid foods, the nutrients in the breast milk are actually declining, which means basically that the child starts to seek out food. So it's really important that when we feed our kids for the first time that we start getting calcium in fairly quickly. I wouldn't say it's like the first nutrient I'd consider, but it's high up on the list. And we don't tend to give cow's milk in the first year because it can be quite filling. I mean, cow's milk is a drink. However, it can be added to food. So if you're making like a baby porridge, for example, or you could, give a little bit of yogurt, but we have to be careful not to give too much. And that's just because children tend to like milk products unless they have an intolerance or allergy. And it's quite easy to get a lot in them. And that being said, it basically can displace other nutrients. So it's important to include, but yeah, being careful not to give too much. For those of you who are looking for a soy milk that is fortified in Japan, I've looked a couple of up. There's the Alpro Soya unsweetened soy milk and something called, and you'll have to excuse my pronunciation here, Sujata Mireku adjusted soy milk. If anyone wants as well, I've got a list of different soy milks for vegans, which I found actually on the internet, but it looked quite comprehensive. So yeah, I can provide that after if anyone needs. So yeah, calcium works in conjunction with vitamin D, and sufficient vitamin D helps the calcium absorption. So it basically assists the calcium to be absorbed into the bones and help the bones remodel themselves. Bones are constantly remodeling. So yeah. All right, I'll go on to vitamin D. So vitamin D is really healthy, important for bone health, but also for immunity. So this is quite a good thing, obviously, because children are getting sick a lot. So we want to make sure that they've got adequate vitamin D. So along with the sun, vitamin D can be obtained from foods such as oily fish, so salmon, fatty tuna, herring, mackerel, also from eggs, particularly in the egg yolk, liver, fortified margarine, so those with added vitamin D, and also fortified milk. And there are some milks with added vitamin D. However, it's quite difficult to get enough vitamin D from food, and it's not as readily absorbed as it is from the sun. Now, in Japan, obviously, people cover themselves up quite a lot, and there's quite a lot of vitamin D deficiency here. So that's the result of basically people just keeping out of the sun and, wearing sunscreen. Sunscreen can block the absorption of vitamin D. Anyone living up in the north in Hokkaido will also not be absorbing as much due to the latitude on the globe. The same goes for New Zealand and the South Island in winter. There's no vitamin D absorbed, and also in parts of Australia. So depends where you come from and also where you're pregnant if you're a mother. So the baby stores mostly come from when they're in utero. So that means that the mother's vitamin D status when she is pregnant is very, very important for the child. From after birth, there are very low levels in breast milk. There's a little bit added to formula, but again, it's harder to absorb. And of course, we're not going to go put our newborn babies out into the sun. So the mother status is, just really important. So it's good to get your vitamin D checked if you're pregnant, or even just supplement if you can't get it checked, because there's no harm in supplementing, and your GP can advise you on this. So what happens if we're deficient in vitamin D? It basically, you can risk the child getting rickets, which is thin, weak, deformed bones, essentially. So yeah, in New Zealand, it's a requirement for children who are breastfed over the winter months to be supplemented with vitamin D. The standard recommendations are basically for the first 2 years. However, experts in vitamin D would argue that it could be up to 5 years that it would be good to supplement your child. So supplementing a child basically means giving them a little drop of vitamin D into their food or onto their tongue if you want. And we tend to do this once breastfeeding is established. So yeah, it's very safe to do, and one little drop a day is they don't taste it, they don't notice it. So something to think about. So yeah, it's very, very common to have vitamin D deficiency in many parts of Asia and also in the Middle East. Infants who are at higher risk of deficiency are actually those that are breastfed because of the low levels in the milk, but also those who have naturally darker skin or whose mothers have darker skin. If a mother has low vitamin D levels herself, siblings who have had rickets or seizures, and also infants born preterm with a low body weight may also be vitamin D deficient. All right, so this is one of my favorite nutrients, which is iron. And the reason I've put a picture of a kiwi fruit here is because vitamin C there's really high levels of vitamin C in kiwi fruit, and that helps with the absorption of iron. So iron would be my favorite nutrient for children, I guess. In infancy, it's like the first thing I thought of when I started feeding my children, and that's because of this like crazy stat that infants aged 7 to 12 months need about 11 milligrams a day of iron, which is more than men of any age, which is just a crazy amount. And women do actually have higher requirements than infants because of menstruation. But yeah, infants need a really, really high amount of iron. So it's essential for and vital for growth and also immunity and cognitive function, so brain function essentially. As an infant's iron stores decrease in the first few months of life, it's important to offer iron-rich foods fairly quickly, around 6 months of age. So the best source of iron is heme iron, which is in meat, so red meat, chicken, fish, pork, and that's more readily absorbed. Essentially, that means is that the child's going to have to eat less to get more. And iron, again, just like calcium, it's really important in when they're toddlers and also older children too, because they're just growing so fast, and iron just will help that growth. If you don't eat meat, that's fine. Your child can still get enough iron, but you have to be really conscious about the types of food that you're giving your child. So there's they're good sources of non-heme iron, which is the least readily absorbed iron, but also eggs and legumes. So that's like beans, chickpeas, lentils. Some baby cereals and other cereals are fortified with iron as well, so iron is added. And then also dark green leafy vegetables are another source. You can get some in nuts and nut butter, seeds, tahini, and infant formula as well. But yeah, it's just harder to get. Now, liver is also a good source of iron, but it's also high in vitamin A. So some people, really promote this a lot on the internet to give your baby liver, if you can even stomach cooking it yourself. I actually didn't because I can't stand the thought of it. But if you do want to give it, it's a really good source of iron. So I'm not against it, but you just have to be careful not to give too much because of the vitamin A, which is too much can lead to toxicity. So what does that mean? It means limiting it basically to 3 teaspoons a week, which is 15 grams for infants. All right. Yeah, and again, iron's low in breast milk and depletes over time, just like with calcium. And yeah, what does iron deficiency anemia look like? How would you know if your baby was low in iron? It is quite hard to tell. It can result in fatigue, but it's always, babies are tired a lot. Weakness, headaches, impaired brain function and immunity, pale skin, and poor resistance to cold temperatures. So again, really, really hard to tell in younger children. If you think your child may be at risk, or if you're following a vegan diet or even a vegetarian diet, you can always ask your general practitioner to check the child just to make sure. All right. So another important thing for children is essential fatty acids. So this is right across childhood, and I don't think this is talked about enough. Um, we tend to put our own dietary opinions onto our children in terms of what we think is healthy if we're trying to feed our child a healthy diet. In the past, there's been a lot of talk of fat being unhealthy. And for children, it's actually really important that they get healthy fat. So, what does healthy fat mean? That basically means fat from oils and nuts and seeds, and also from fish, if possible. Those are the main sources. And what does it do? It's important for brain function. So, healthy fats contain essential fatty acids, and these facilitate the absorption of fat soluble vitamins. So the fat soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K. So the vitamin D, if you're worried about vitamin D deficiency, ensuring that your child has a bit of fat is actually quite important. Um, so yeah, really important for the central nervous system and development of the heart as well, and cardiovascular systems, and also for mental health. So there's been more recent studies actually in Japanese children that have shown that fish intake is inversely related to depression or depressive symptoms. So basically, that means that the fatty acids in fish are potentially likely to be protective against things like depression. Again, there's always errors in studies, so we have to take that with caution, but there is science to show it could have benefit. So what does that mean? How much healthy fats do we need to include? It's usually for young children around 5 grams a day if not vegetarian, and around 10 to 20 grams a day if vegetarian, and that's for the under twos. And then with the over twos, I just say just add some to meals. If put avocado in things, cook things with olive oil. Give them nut butters if they're not allergic to nuts. Give them nuts once they're old enough to have them and it's not a choking risk. Just trying to include, and of course, fish, trying to include them in the diet where possible. All right. And then I'll quickly touch on vitamin B12. I recorded a podcast a couple of weeks ago with Sam, so there'll be information about that at the end, but I've got more information on what I'm talking about today on the podcast. So there's more particularly on vitamin B12 and other things, but basically it's essential for vegan mothers during pregnancy and vegan children. The symptoms are particularly in infants, things like tremor, irritability, and like basically trouble breathing, seizures. These are all things that would potentially indicate vitamin B12 deficiency. And yeah, for adults, there are fatigue and paralysis, which is horrible, sore tongue, all sorts of things, poor appetite and constipation. So quite general symptoms there. But again, particularly if you're vegan, you must go to your GP to check the child and to make sure they're getting enough vitamin B12. But I also recommend it for vegetarian parents to at least see a dietitian to talk things through. All right, so what does a balanced meal look like? So I'm going to talk about carbohydrate, protein, and fruits and vegetables here. Okay. So this is how I like to look at a balanced meal for children. This is actually true also for adults, but I'm trying to put it in the context of children today, and also to try and unwind any information that you may have received or about your own nutrition and nutrition for adults. So what does it look like? Basically every meal, it's 1 to 2 vegetables or fruit, and this is for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 1 grain food or starchy vegetable, and either 1 milk or milk alternative food, so that being like a soy product as a milk alternative, or 1 animal or plant-based protein food. So plant-based protein, nuts, legumes, eggs, fish, chicken, red meat. So that's what a meal can look like. So how does that practically look? So this is what I'm thinking at breakfast. So I'm feeding my child breakfast and I'm thinking I would like them to have some fruit, Usually I choose fruit at breakfast because it's easier, but sometimes, something like an avocado, that what's actually avocado is considered a fruit as well. Most people would define that as a vegetable. But so I do an apple, say, and then on this with beside some toast with some nut butter on it, for example. So if I'm giving toast in the morning, I'm not putting jam or marmalade. My children love jam and marmalade on the toast, without giving like some sort of a protein as well. So maybe I'd do like a piece of toast with peanut butter, and then if they are still hungry, I'd be fine to give them a little bit of jam or marmalade. Because I know that they've had their protein, but I want to make sure that they're getting carbohydrate and protein at breakfast. And this is just to sustain them throughout the morning. And then the fruit is there for some extra nutrition, essentially. So if we're giving really like food, like carbohydrates without protein, it can mean basically that the child burns that energy really quickly and gets hungry again. But it can also impact their mood as well. So yeah, another example here is, so banana is considered a carbohydrate. So I'm doing like some blueberries and yogurt with some chopped banana, for example, for breakfast. Usually my kids need more than that, but yeah, for some parents that can be an option. Then I've got here some strawberries, but it can be any fruit, right? With some oats, so I'll make like a porridge on the stove. Or if I don't have time, I'll do overnight oats. So I essentially just put some oats in a bowl, pour some milk on, whether it's soy milk with calcium in it or cow's milk, it doesn't matter. And then I might just put some fruit in it too and put it in the fridge overnight. And in the morning, I just take it out and put it straight in the microwave. So super quick for those who struggle in the morning to get everything done on time. And then, yeah, another example is some eggs and avocado on toast. So again, the avocado being the fruit, the toast being the carbohydrate, and the egg being the protein. All right. And then I've got, this would be like a lunch or a dinner. We do also tend to do sandwiches in our house, and I haven't included that here. But say I'm doing like more of a Japanese style meal, it might be, rice with chicken. So rice is a carbohydrate, chicken's a protein, and then I've got some edamame and some mushroom in there. I know most children, like a lot of children, won't like a lot of these vegetables, but this is like something you work towards. One of my children likes mushroom, the other one doesn't. Neither of them really like zucchini at the moment at 3 and 4.5. But we got them most of the other ones at the moment. But every child is different, right? Some children only like 1 or 2 vegetables. So this is the method, I guess. So then if I was doing, I could do like a pasta with salmon. I might make like a creamy salmon sauce. So the salmon being the protein, the pasta being the carbohydrate. And then I'd probably only get away with putting broccoli on the side for my children, but if, ideally it'd be broccoli and zucchini because it's 2 vegetables. And yeah, then there's some more like traditional, I guess, Western English kind of dinner or lunch, but like some red meat with some mashed potato and some peas and carrots. Or there's pasta here. And at the bottom, so I've got like a sauce which I'd make with like, you can make it with carrots or you can make it with tomato where you grate the carrots in, or capsicum, peppers. And yeah, so then that's the pasta sauce. And then at the bottom there, it's grated cheese. So grated cheese is the protein, but it's also got some fat in it too. For really young children, I tend to also roast vegetables. I like to feed vegetables first, if possible, when starting solids. And if they're not receptive to the bitter taste of the vegetables, roasting them can help because you can put a little bit of olive oil and get a little bit of that fat in there. You may be trialing one food at a time. And yeah, basically roasting them makes them a little bit sweeter, but they're still getting the vegetable. And yeah, then we've got the Mediterranean diet. So this is the, I guess, ideal dietary pattern that I guess a dietitian would recommend. Yeah, we all have, like I said, we've all got our own opinions about nutrition. Everyone's an expert in their own body. But when it comes to feeding children, regardless of your own thoughts on nutrition, if you don't know what to aim for, you're confused for yourself, just look up the Mediterranean diet. And this is the Mediterranean dietary pyramid, I guess, where it's mostly vegetables and whole grain carbohydrates with a little bit of red meat, but mostly, things like fish. And then you've got a bit of eggs, and the treats are like right at the top there. So still including some of that in the diet, but it's certainly not the main foods. All right. So tips for feeding baby for the first time. And for those of you who have already had young babies, you can sit back and relax because this will be old news to you. So essentially, the first thing to do is to make sure your child is ready for solids. Okay, so how do I know whether my baby is ready? Here are some of the cues. So the baby needs to be around 6 months of age. Technically, it's between 4 and 6 months, but don't rush into it if you're concerned. Just hold back till you can see all of these signs. They can hold their head up and they have control over their head and neck. They sit alone with some support is fine. So like there's those little chairs they can sit in where that kind of supports them around their hips and their lower back. If they need that to sit up, it's still fine. But certainly that they're not like slumping over in one of those little chairs. Brings objects to their mouth, opens their mouth as food approaches, can keep food in their mouth and swallow it instead of pushing the food out. And again, they will push it around a bit because they've never had food in their mouth before. So if you're trying for the first time, they're kind of pushing it out, but then they still kind of seem interested, then it might be worth persevering so long as they have all of these other signs. And then shows interest in food and watching other people eat. Yeah, I suggest beginning with one food at a time and then slowly introducing more. There's no evidence to show which food to start with. And that can be quite hard because people are like, well, what do I do? Like, what do I start with? I started my children with kumara, and there was some research going on at the university I worked for in infant nutrition and the role of kumara, which is basically sweet potato, in Japan. Kumara is a Maori native New Zealand word for sweet potato. There was research around the gut microbiome with giving kumara as a first food and sweet potato as a first food, and there was some really positive results coming out. I'll talk about the microbiome and what that means later. But that if you need something and you just like, what do I do? Then just start with that because, it's not a bad option. So starting with one vegetable, moving to the next. I preferred to use more bitter flavors over the sweet. Maybe not for the first 2 weeks, but then after that. So rather than starting with the fruits, I tried to start with the vegetables because I knew that babies love sweet taste. So it's going to be harder to give them the vegetables than it is to give them the fruit. So I wanted them to get used to the vegetables before the fruit. Or you can mix vegetables and fruit together. And again, these are no rules. I'm just telling you what I did based on my knowledge. Like I said, there's no evidence as to what you should start with. Texture progression is really important. So when you first start, if it's before 6 months, the food needs to be really, really watered down. So when I say watered down, I mean it's like you have it on a spoon and you tip the spoon and it runs off the spoon. So this is when I say watered down as well, I mean adding formula or breast milk to the puree. From 6 months, it still needs to be a smooth puree. And then you're progressing through the textures. So you're trying to make it a bit lumpier and mashed over time. Essentially, by 9 months of age, a child should be having lumpy textures. There's evidence to show that if you do not progress quick enough through the textures, there can be feeding difficulties later. And it is also associated with a lower fruit and vegetable intake in older children, probably because of the feeding difficulties and the parents get desperate and give them whatever they want. So just try your best. There's no judgment. You just have to do your best. And we've only got some guidelines. Nutrition is really difficult to study. These are just ideas. Until 1 year of age, infants should be given solid foods in conjunction with breast milk or infant formula. Okay, so that means a separate feed of formula or breast milk. There's also no scientific evidence to show what time of day to feed your child solid food, so it's up to you. I chose late morning. The only evidence around time of day pertains to allergenic food. So when you're testing allergens, so the food allergens, you want to do it in the morning so you can keep an eye on your child during the day, as opposed to feeding them in potential allergenic food and then putting them to sleep, because then they might have an allergic reaction and then they're asleep and you might not know. So yeah. When is it best to increase from 1 meal to 2? Best practice suggests that when they're eating from 1/4 of a cup to 1/2 a cup, it's a good time to add an extra meal. All right. So taste preferences. Again, I want to talk about, what happens in utero, what happens from 6 to 12 months, and how do we help our child learn to like new foods. And then I'm going to get on to the older children as well. Okay, so taste preferences are developing before the child is born. So they're evolving during the first trimester of pregnancy, which is totally crazy because you're just getting your head around the fact that you're pregnant and probably feeling nauseous and not great. So smell and taste are developing at this time, and they are functionally mature well before birth, okay? So the child can actually taste, which is bizarre, the food that you eat during pregnancy if you're a mother listening. They can taste it through the amniotic fluid. And from a very, very young age, they can learn to enjoy sour and bitter tastes. Infants whose mums regularly consume certain foods in pregnancy have been shown to have a preference for certain foods. So there's a study done on garlic, and mums that ate heaps of garlic, their children liked garlic from quite a young age. There's another one with carrots. Children preferred carrots to plain cereal as first foods. And these developments can continue until a child is even at 5, they're looking at what a mum ate in pregnancy, and a 5-year-old, and those who, ate carrots in pregnancy at 5, the child preferred carrots. Of course, this isn't going to be true for every food. Some parents would say mums probably said that they lived on potato chips because that's all they could stomach, and the child is not fussed. So yeah, infants do, like I said, tend to prefer sweet food, but also the umami flavors as well. So that's like your miso kind of taste. There's a lot of umami here in Japan, but also like I said, they can learn to like sour too. What about school-age children? And preschool age children, exposure is key. Okay, so regardless of what you did, if that time is behind you, basically you just have to keep trying to expose your child to different tastes. So evidence shows that children have to be exposed to a new food between 6 and 15 times before any intake is shown or preference toward that food is shown. So what do I mean by intake? I mean, for some children, it could take 16 or 15 times before they even put it in their mouth. If they put it in their mouth, it's a win. You've done really well. That is considered a success because the child has tried the food, even if they don't eat it. Okay. And that's also, you just leave it on the plate. You keep persevering, which I know can be more challenging than it sounds. A positive environment is also super, super important. So yeah, keeping the meal time a really happy time, even if a child is putting up a fight. In our house, and I've said this on the podcast too, the plan is that my children have to leave the food on their plate. That even has been a struggle at times when they know there's a food there that they don't want. So for me, it's a win for them to even keep that food on their plate. So my rule is that, I try and keep half the foods at least on the plate that children like. Sometimes it's a bit more than half. So foods that I know they'll eat, and then there might be a new food, or not necessarily a new food, but a food that I know that they might eat half the time, or maybe not at all. Maybe they've never eaten it. So my son, cauliflower, just never eaten it, still goes on the plate. It just sits there, and after the meal, it's still there every time. So what do we do about children who only like a small variety of food? Okay. One of the first things I say, so I call it selective eating rather than fussy eating, but like I said, positive environment, child should never be pressured to eat, okay? We've got to trust our child to put the food in their mouth if they want to. Okay, it's their body, they decide what to put in there. Okay, so there are exceptional circumstances. There are children who have very complex disordered eating, and I recommend that's not my specialty. I recommend getting some medical advice for that if your child is losing weight or has, severe eating problems. But with general selective eating, which is very normal, I suggest the following. So, and also I should say, sometimes they're not selective in the first year, and then after the first year, they become selective, and it can last a few years. My daughter's just come out of it at 4.5. I'm amazed. She's a foodie as well. So to me, that's quite early to stop being selective. But yeah, so if your 7-year-old's still picky, or don't worry, it's normal. The pressure thing is really important. So the philosophy goes in our house, I choose what goes on your plate and you choose what you put in your mouth. Okay, so this is on repeat. They say to me, I don't want that on my plate. I say, it's my job to cook you the food and put it on your plate. It's your job to decide what you eat. There may be a tantrum. My 3-year-old may be on the floor. I'm not going to eat dinner. I'm not going to eat anything else. That's fine. No problem. And I just repeat, it's my job to cook you the dinner and put it on your plate. It's your job to decide what you want to eat. Okay. Another good thing is setting table rules, which again can be easier said than done. So every house is different. For us, it's sitting at the table while we're eating. I actually ask my children to both stay at the table till they've both finished, only because one of them eats really fast and disappears, and the other one is like a bit more take it or leave it with food. And as soon as he sees her finished and off playing, he wants to leave the table and play. He's got distracted. He's seen her playing and he's off doing his thing. So that's why in our house, they both stay at the table. Yeah. Another thing that can be helpful with lunches and things, your children who come home with a full lunchbox, is helping them, getting them to be involved in what goes in the lunchbox. You can make the lunchbox the night before if you want to, if mornings are hard. Okay. Admittedly, if you're doing sandwiches, the bread's not going to be as fresh. I take the bread out of the freezer and just make it with frozen bread so that it's like, by the time they're at school, it's actually really fresh, like it's just defrosted. So it can be kept fresher for longer. But yeah, if you just do what you need to do, if you want your child to help you and the night before is a better time for that, then just do it 7 p.m. and then the lunchboxes go in the fridge overnight. Another thing is showing them what's in their lunchbox, and that can be really helpful too. So before they go to school, my children always ask me what's in my lunchbox. And so I just open it up and they say, can I have a piece? And I'm like, oh, okay, you can have one small thing, and that might be like a raisin or something. So yeah, I show them so that they don't get to lunch and go, oh, I don't like that. Or, oh, mummy, I really wanted to talk to mummy about that. I also have a rule that I'm not going to change anything out, because of course then they say I don't want that. And yeah, so it takes time. If you need more advice, follow Jennifer Anderson, on Instagram at Kids Eat in Color. She is an American dietitian. She's fabulous. I met her at a conference in Washington in 2018, and she's got well over 1 million followers, and she's just all good with all the tips. She calls it fussy eating. She's got all sorts of like resources to share, programs that she can work through you with online, and it's just like good reminders. Another thing I do, and again, this isn't scientific evidence, this is just based on the knowledge I have in working with my children, is before bed, I always give them something to eat. So the reason I do this is because one of my children used to wake up at 4 a.m. hungry. They weren't eating their dinner or their full dinner, and they went to bed, they thought they were full, and then they woke up. Okay. I tend to give something because I know that if they eat dinner at say 5:30 in the afternoon, there's quite a long time until they go to bed. I don't want them to wake up early, but also I feel like I'm more relaxed about them not eating their dinner or finishing their dinner because I know they've got something before bed. So Jennifer Anderson does this too, and it can look, there's all sorts of things you can give. I tend to give yogurt with some blueberries or some fruit because it's the protein and a bit of carbohydrate in there fills them up. I leave a good gap between dinner and the food after. So they often say to me, can I have my yogurt now? And I look at their plate and they've only eaten a couple of things. And I'm like, they want their yogurt for dinner. And I say, no, you have to wait. We do that before bed. And that's just what we do. And again, Jennifer Anderson has heaps of different suggestions as to what you can give before bed. So that just takes the pressure off me as well. If one of my children just really doesn't eat much for dinner, I know at least they're going to have something that they like. So the key thing before bed, or if you're doing this, is to make sure it's something that they like. I also do then, like, they do have a bit of time between their eating and sleep. So it might be 25 minutes or something. And then I clean their teeth and things. But yeah, that's what works for us. There's other things I've mentioned on the podcast too. So yeah. The microbiome, what is it? Why is it important? And which foods support it? Okay. Here we go. So the microbiome is essentially trillions of microorganisms, which we also call microbes, from thousands of different species. Okay, these include not only bacteria, but fungi, parasites, and viruses. I know it sounds full on. In a healthy person, these bugs coexist peacefully, with largest numbers found in the small and large intestines, but they're also found throughout the body. So the microbiome was labeled by Harvard University as a supporting organ. And that's because it plays so many key roles in promoting the smooth daily operations of the human body. Each person has an entirely unique microbiome or set of microbes in their body. And it is originally, when a child is born, it's determined by their DNA as well as their mother. So the children are first exposed to microbes through their mother as an infant, during the delivery, in the birth canal, or as soon as they come out, if it's a cesarean section. There will be less from the mother if it's a cesarean section birth. But they also get it from mum's breast milk, even if only breastfeeding for a short amount of time. Exactly which microbes the baby's exposed to really depends solely on the mother initially, particularly for vaginal birth. And then later on, there's all sorts of environmental factors that change the microbiome. So the factors can be beneficial, or they can also put a child at greater risk of things like disease. But most are helpful. And yeah. So in a healthy body, the good and the bad microbes exist together without problems. Okay, so everyone has the less helpful ones too, but there's no issue. However, sometimes there can be a bit of a disturbance in the balance of the microbiome. So infectious illnesses, prolonged use of antibiotics, and other bacteria destroying medications, and also certain diets as well. Okay, so diets tend, like really high fat sugar diets, tend to disrupt the microbiome. And this is true for adults as well. And when this happens, the body can become more susceptible to illness. Okay, so if your child has had antibiotics, it can be a good idea to give them a probiotic. And I've talked about this on the podcast a bit too. But if you want, there's more information there. But essentially, there is limited data with probiotics, but with some particular strains, there is benefit shown, particularly for things like antibiotic-associated diarrhea. I think it's 1 in 9 children. Taking a probiotic supplement with the correct strain of bacteria can help to prevent the diarrhea, essentially. Mention of the strains is on the podcast. But yeah, you just have to make sure that you're giving it for the right reason. And what even is a probiotic? It's essentially a powder for children that you put in to a food that they're eating. They don't necessarily taste it or know it's there. You can put it in water too if you want to make a drink. But I used to just put it in food because then they didn't even know it was there. And that was after a course of antibiotics. I particularly used it because that was where the best evidence was. There are some other uses of probiotics too, but yeah, you can find them online as well. You kind of need to know your research. If your child is really like susceptible to illness, it'd be worth just discussing it with your doctor or your dietitian. Okay. Supporting foods. So essentially vegetables and fruit and grain foods, particularly whole grain foods, and starchy vegetables are particularly important for your child's gut bacteria. So there's another reason to give the vegetables and fruit. The starchy vegetables are the potatoes, the sweet potato, the corn is another one, and a starchy fruit would be like a banana. So they're really, really helpful for the microbiome and getting a healthy balance of, I guess, bugs to strengthen the immune system. And that's actually because of something called resistant starch. Another thing, if you reheat, like you cool pasta and reheat it, that also contains resistant starch as well, which can be really beneficial. The fiber in the foods is really helpful for the microbiome. So fiber essentially is the non-digestible part of a vegetable, as an example, or a grain, and it gets all the way to the colon, which is toward the end of the digestive tract. So a lot of things are digested and they disappear in the food as it moves through your digestive system, through your bowel. But if it makes it to the large bowel or the colon, that means that it can ferment there and essentially promote the good bacteria. And there's also fermented foods, including full-fat yogurt, miso, tofu, natto. I haven't managed for my children to eat natto yet, although I've had some recommendations to put it in Philadelphia cream cheese on a cracker, and that's from Gutsy UK. So if you look on Instagram at Gutsy_UK, you can get some amazing tips on the microbiome. And she's got lots of practical suggestions for giving children fermented foods. And here in Japan, we're so lucky that we're surrounded by fermented foods. So yeah, all sorts of ideas. Olives as well can be beneficial. Yeah, so tips like this is one of her tips around not heating miso to a high heat, but adding it like a miso paste to a mayonnaise or a yogurt as a dip. Or different ways to prepare tofu as an example. So definitely check out her Instagram if you get a chance. And food allergies and intolerances. Okay, so I'm going to discuss what is the difference, key food allergens, and when is the best time to introduce allergens. Have a sip of water. All right, so in New Zealand, these are the ones that are listed as the key food allergens. Same in Australia. It'll be very similar in the US and the UK. There might be small differences. I'm not sure why there are differences in what is considered key, as in like the most high risk foods for an allergic reaction, but here they are. Okay, so the difference between an allergy and an intolerance. So a food intolerance is essentially an adverse reaction to a food involving the digestive system as opposed to the immune system, okay? So there might be an example, people can be intolerant to lactose. So that might mean that they don't have enough lactase enzyme in the digestive system and they can't digest the lactose in milk products very well or not at all. Okay, so they might get diarrhea or something from that. So that is in their digestive system. The immune system is a totally different thing altogether. Basically, it's the body is having an attack essentially, and it can present really, really quickly and can be more life-threatening essentially. It's really scary if your child is allergic to something. So symptoms of a food intolerance can take up to 20 hours to present, in contrast to symptoms of a food allergy. And they tend to often appear more quickly with an allergy. Okay, so usually within minutes of eating or touching a specific food. Again, if you're unsure as to whether your child is having an allergic reaction, seek medical attention immediately. Okay, it's better just to call up and get some advice straight away than wait around and figure it out later, and it's too late or things get really bad and you're in an ambulance. So the symptoms of a food intolerance, they can include stomach pain, bloating, flatulence, diarrhea, constipation. My child was technically allergic to eggs, and he vomited, and that was the only sign I got. So that I sort of felt like a bit more of an intolerance thing, but it was still an allergy. The two key food, so there's really, really common ones in children. The main ones are peanuts, tree nuts, cow's milk, and eggs. Those are the most common. Children are really likely to grow out of cow's milk allergies and egg allergies. Okay, and for some children, it only takes a couple of months. But if there's a cow's milk allergy, the mum usually has to, and his mum is breastfeeding, mum often has to basically stop consuming cow's milk herself and cow's milk products. So when is the best time to give your child food allergens? So I wouldn't be giving them for the first time. I wouldn't be giving them as a first food. So I'd be getting my child started on solids. But then seriously, within a couple of weeks of them starting, I would be starting to consider testing the allergens. So back in the day, and not actually that long ago, the advice was that you should delay introducing food allergens. So basically hold off till a year, particularly if a child was allergic. That advice has now been flipped on its head, and the advice now is that we give the food allergens as soon as possible to test them. Okay, so we're giving them earlier in the day. We're giving them, so like in the morning sometime to test, we're giving a really tiny amount. Okay, so I probably wouldn't start with peanut because, I don't know, peanut allergies just freak me out because they can be quite serious with anaphylaxis and things where a child can't breathe properly. So I'd be starting with something other than peanuts. So say cow's milk as an example. So I might just mix I don't know, half a teaspoon of cow's milk or even a quarter, just a couple of drops into a puree and giving it and just waiting and seeing if anything happens. The next day I might just add a little bit more. And again, monitoring the child. And then if cow's milk was deemed to be fine, then I'd tick that off and move on to the next one. The reason the advice changed in terms of when to give allergens was based on some really crucial studies in the early 2000s. Okay, so not actually that long ago, with some researchers at King's College London essentially discovered that school-aged Jewish children in the UK were 10 times more likely to develop peanut allergy than Jewish children of similar ancestry in Israel. Okay, so you've got two groups of children living in different countries, but a similar, I guess, genetic background. And they did a randomized controlled trial, and they theorized initially that it was due to early exposure of peanuts in infancy in Israeli children. So there's this peanut-based snack called bamba, and it's given really commonly as a first food. So the children in Israel are getting this food, but the Israeli children in the UK are not, or lots of them aren't. Okay, so they made sure that the children in the UK definitely weren't being sent this snack from home. And then they looked into it. So it was actually 2015 when they published the first randomized controlled trial in the New England Medical Journal. So this is the most prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journal in the world. It's really, really hard to get your research published in that journal. And it involved 640 babies who they were at high risk of peanut allergy. Okay, so they had siblings with a peanut allergy, or they had eczema. That's another sign that a child could be at higher risk of allergy. And the children were between 4 and 11 months. So half of them were given the peanut-containing food and the other half were not. So they had a control group, and then they looked at whether the children developed a peanut allergy by 5 years of age. Okay, so they followed these children from the lowest age of 4 months all the way to 5 years. And 17% of the children in the control group who did not receive the peanuts early on developed a peanut allergy, and only 3% of the children who ate the peanuts early on developed an allergy. Okay, so this is a huge difference. And of course, there's confounding factors, and they all discuss all of that too. What if the children with mild allergies were being diagnosed as allergic in the UK, and in Israel they had severe allergies. There's all sorts of things that could be at play here, but they keep retesting it, and yeah. Causality, so the cause of something is really difficult to prove. So this is why nutrition is so complex, nutrition science. Yeah. You've also it's really tricky with science because you don't, or at least you know how to read a scientific paper in detail and look out for bias and know what you're looking for. You don't actually know. So you can read the abstract, you can read the paper in full, and it can sound really positive, but you can't take that for granted. Things that can help is that if a study is published in a reputable journal, that can help. There are other things. If here's an example. A study funded by the American National Mango Board demonstrated that eating mangoes may reduce facial wrinkles in older women. And then the authors go and declare they've got no conflict of interest, and you can see that the study was paid for by the American National Mango Board. I'm just trying to explain how complicated it can be with science. Anyway, this was a really, really good study, and so now it's changed everything. The American College of Pediatrics changed their recommendations, and it's around the world now that early introduction is really, really important. Okay. How do you introduce them? So what foods did I use? And again, there's no rules around this. I'm just letting you know so that if you're doing it yourself, you have an idea. So for peanuts, I used smooth peanut butter in just a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. For tree nuts, I think I used almond butter. For cow's milk, I used just cow's milk. For soy, I used soy milk. For egg, I started with cooked egg, okay? Because the cooking can also have a different effect. For sesame, I used tahini, so I mix a tiny bit of tahini into a puree. For wheat, in New Zealand, we have these sticks that children can chew on for teething that have wheat in them. They're like food, like hard bread, essentially. Or you could give bread as long as they're not at risk of choking. For fish, I think I used a tiny bit of smoked salmon. And for seafood, I might have used a tiny bit of prawn, just pureed. So, yeah. As I mentioned before, if you have any concerns, please discuss it with your doctor or your dietitian. Okay. So that is the end of what I've got to talk about today, but I'm here for as long as you need to answer questions. And also the podcast is the Tokyo Living podcast hosted by Sam. So yeah, feel free as well. I'm online. I do online consults. I did a consult last night to someone in Shizuoka. So I'm available online if you're not in the central Tokyo area, and also in person as well if you would like to come in person. And some dietitian consults are claimable under international health insurance as well. So yeah, thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that, Rebecca. I can't see any questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions?
Sam, I've got a quick one. It's Nicole. Hi there.
Go for it, Nicole.
Hi, Rebecca. The question I had was the glucose goddess, which you might roll your eyes at. And you were talking about a balanced meal, and I'm sure you've read about her, but she talks about the order in which children or anyone eats their food is important because it helps control glucose spikes in bodies. Do you have any thoughts on that? I realize it's a very complicated question.
No, that's a great question. Thank you so much. So essentially, the glucose yes, so some foods can increase glucose in the bloodstream. So like lollies and simple sugars, your white breads, your white rice. So I would be promoting whole grain even with children. So like a brown rice over a white rice, a wholemeal bread, which is quite difficult to find here in Japan. Just trying to find ones with higher fiber essentially over white bread. But your question around the timing of foods. So essentially the evidence just shows that if you combine carbohydrates, so those more simple carbohydrates, so your rice or your bread, or your potatoes with a protein at the same time, it will slow the digestion. It will basically slow the release of glucose into the bloodstream. So that is really beneficial. So that's actually partly why we say to have carbohydrate and protein together. Another thing that is really important for that is fiber. So if you are doing like white rice, because people find it really hard to get brown rice here, having some vegetables with it adds the fiber. So essentially, if you think of the meal as a whole, it slows the breakdown of that meal. So it's not so much the order in which the child eats the food that the evidence shows, it's actually the meal itself and the combination of nutrients within that meal. So even if they eat the rice first and 10 minutes later they eat the vegetables, or 20 minutes later, or they have the protein first and then they have the vegetables and then the carbohydrate, that doesn't matter. It's just within that eating time, the food's still going to be sitting in the stomach before it passes through into the small intestine. So yeah, there's a bit of debunking there, I think, to do around the order issue, and that's not really a problem.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
No worries.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute and jump in.
I've got one more.
Go for it, Nicole.
Excellent.
Got loads. No,
just keep going. Keep going all night.
We've covered. You've covered, I guess, the Mediterranean diet and a balanced meal. What are your thoughts on nutritional supplements as kids get older? Like, for example, magnesium or other supplements?
Another great question. Okay, so I'd actually talk about this in the podcast a bit, but a child shouldn't need to be supplemented unless they have a deficiency, aside from with vitamin D, because the vitamin D stores deplete after birth pretty quickly. And like I said, it's really hard to replace with food. And we have a worry around cancer risk from the sun and not wanting to expose newborn skin to the sun. So vitamin D supplementation is quite important for children. As children get older, if they're vegan, they need vitamin B12. You're very unlikely to send your child for a blood test unless they've got, medical condition. They shouldn't. I'm not pro supplementing children in general unless they're found to be deficient in something. Okay. So I think this is true aside from children with really extreme, like disordered eating, essentially eating, I don't know if you've heard of ARFID or these other conditions where a child might only eat one or two foods and that's all they eat. So that's a different story. But in general, if a child's eating, a couple of different colors of vegetable, even if not many, but there's a couple of different colors, and they're eating some carbohydrate and some protein, then I wouldn't be supplementing them. Not magnesium either.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
No worries. It's more like, and with iron and things, it's more like later on, like when a child's like a teenager, particularly a teenage girl. I'd be starting to think about anemia for like a particularly vegetarian teenage girl, or a girl that didn't really eat any meat who was having heavy periods, and I'd be sending them off for a blood test, because by that stage it's really easier to do a blood test.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful.
No worries. You're welcome to keep asking questions as well if you have any more.
I'm going to stop. I need to get my kids to bed.
All good.
I'm Hannah. I've got a question. So I was
Hi.
just wondering, this may kind of branch out as to the exact topic of what you were talking about today, but I was wondering whether you could talk about some of the key differences in like adult and teen and adolescent nutrition. Are there any differences that are really kind of fundamental in the way our nutrition needs change?
Yes. Okay. So that's a great question. It also depends on how active your child is. Okay. So nutrition needs are really high for children who are competing in sport, essentially, or like lots of activity at school. So their calorie needs as well are much higher. And yeah, their nutrient needs in general. So essentially, they just need to eat a lot more food. And that is something I think particularly I think particularly with teenage girls around body image can be a bit of a concern sometimes, particularly if they're quite lean and they're competing in a lot of sporting activities. Carbohydrate as well is really, really important for teenagers. It can help with hormonal regulation as well. And again, like making sure that your teenager isn't restricting carbohydrates if there's a body image thing going on. I think as well, adults do, particularly adults who are trying to lose weight, do start to get a bit concerned about carbohydrate for themselves. And certainly for women around perimenopause time and menopause, the carbohydrate requirements decrease quite dramatically. So for older women, they decrease for men too, but not as much. So like if you look at like the older woman versus a teenager or a child, the carbohydrate needs of a child are much, much higher. Okay. Protein needs increase with body weight. Okay. So our body needs 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per body weight. Okay. Per kg, sorry, of body weight. So obviously, if a child is 21 kgs, they need a lot less protein than a child who's 42 kgs. Okay, they basically need double the protein. So an adult is a lot heavier than even a teenager. Well, maybe not, depending on how big your teenager is. And so again, the requirements are different there. And that goes the same for calories. If a child is lighter than an adult, then they need less calories unless they're really, really active. So that's probably a bit of a confusing answer, but essentially trying to just think about that Mediterranean dietary pattern and getting a real variety of foods into your child is probably the best that you can do. And then trusting their hunger instincts, okay? It's sometimes that can be really hard, particularly if a child's always saying they're hungry. To be like, really, are you really, just we have to trust their instincts, but also remind them if they're active and particularly in summer to drink enough water. Okay. So water, hydration and hunger go hand in hand. So sometimes children and adults think that they are hungry when they're actually thirsty. Okay. So making sure if you feel like your child just has been eating all day and not stopping, they're just going, asking for more and more, making sure that they're well hydrated is super important. And Tokyo in summer, it's crazy.
Thank you so much. That was a really helpful answer.
No worries.
Nicole, you got anything else?
I'll stop. I could keep talking all night.
Any other questions? Another 5 seconds. Okay, well, thank you all for joining tonight and for participating. I know I got a lot out of that, as I did from the podcast, which Rebecca mentioned. You can catch that on iTunes and Spotify and all the normal places, along with 111 other episodes. And like Rebecca said, she's available for consultations both in person at Club 360 and online. Rebecca, thank you very much for that. And yeah, if anyone has any other topics that you would like either a podcast episode or perhaps another one of these seminars on, please let us know.
Great.
Thanks again, Rebecca. And yeah.
Thanks, Sam. And people, feel free to email me too if you've got another quick question after this. I'm happy to answer via email as well.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.